Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Cam McGallis. I'll be moderating this panel, and I'm from Platypus. I'm in the New York chapter. Platypus is a project for the self-education and employee self-overcoming of the left. And what that means is that we host discussions with the left in order to figure out what is our present possibilities, and we talk to people from different political organizations, journal projects, individual activists, etc., to ask them some critical questions about their political practice and their ideas about the left. The website is up there, and there's a New York specific website with things that we do in New York City, and we have a free publication over there, as well as I put up our little poster with the different panels that we have in the Brecht Forum. There's only actually one more that we have. It's at 3 p.m. and it's about third parties. So this panel is on Occupy, and I should say a couple of things about Platypus' involvement in Occupy. In New York City, this has taken the form of individual members at first being curious about what was happening at Security and going down and being part of different committees and having conversations with a lot of people, like in the think tank committee or the Visions and Goals committee or in the policy reform committee, just sort of figuring out what the discussion was about. And from our experience at Security Park, we decided that we should have some kind of event in which we invite these people who clearly have different political perspectives and different sort of political imaginations of what Occupy should be about, and we should have a roundtable discussion with them. And so we did 2 events in New York City, one of them which happened in November, the other one which happened in December, in which we asked members of different committees at Occupy some critical questions about the political content of the movement, where they see it going, what would they like to see from it, what kind of transformations they envision. And so this panel, I guess it's a little bit different because something that a lot of us have been thinking about and talking about has been the relationship between different historical moments, different global movements, hence the title of the panel, 2011, 1968, 1999, 2012 question mark. Like, if we give Occupy a history, what kind of history can we say that it has? I know that a lot of individuals that have been involved in Occupy consider themselves to be continuing their work from the alterglobalization movement. Some of them that are totally new to politics maybe are less aware or recognize or even maybe counter this like residual history. And then there's always the presence of 1968, which is our imagination of protest politics, kind of high watermark of American protest politics. And so all of these different ghosts kind of haunt the Occupy movement, and maybe that was a plug for your article. Dave's writing an article for us on the zombie of 1968. And so we want to make sense of it. Like, what is it that, what kind of history do we give Occupy? Okay, so that's it. So our 2 panelists are Brooke Lehman. Brooke is a faculty member of the Institute of Social Ecology, and she has been active in the alterglobalization movement and now in Occupy. And next to her is Dave Hack, and he has done work, is doing work with Occupy Your Workplace, who is organizing an action for May 1st as part of the efforts. Okay. And he's also a contributor to the Platypus Review, and his article is going to be in the next issue. Great, cool. So, sure.
I'm going to be talking about mostly about the anti-globalization movement, alter-globalization movement, and not 1968.
Sounds fine.
Okay, we're good. In thinking about sort of how the alter-globalization movement, this sort of the legacy of the alter-globalization movement has left OWS and how that's continued, there's, for me, a very clear continuity in a lot of respects. There's a lot of discontinuity as well, but I think, you know, when I think about my activist trajectory, I can literally remember sort of conversations that sort of ended in 2001 that I feel like are now being taken up by this movement. They're being taken up by completely different actors, but it's a lot of the same conversations. You can see sort of where we left off being taken up. And I think that the Occupy movement has surpassed the alter-globalization movement in a lot of respects. There are things that I don't think it does as well as the alter-globalization movement did, but I think for the most part, there's been a lot of, I feel a lot feel more excited about this movement on many levels. Obviously, it's had a wider impact in the United States conversation than we ever did in the past. So I just want to sort of start with, I'm going to talk about some of the problems. So I'm going to sort of hit a couple of different themes, both the things that I think we lent to the movement that are really positive, but I also think there are a number of sort of messes that the alterglobalization movement sort of left off with, things that were unresolved that are now, that were sort of handed down through literature, through discussion to this movement in an unresolved way. And I feel like this movement has yet to resolve them as well. So it's sort of like they were sort of looking at the historical past and taking some things as places to build on that were really shaky foundations. So I want to hit some of those because I think those are what are most important in terms of what I see this movement grappling with. So the three areas that I want to look at is direct action, horizontal politics, and then looking at strategy. And so first, just looking at the sort of the direct action piece, I think that you know, on the positive side, the anti-globalization movement was a departure from a lot of previous movements and also was different than the anti-war movement that followed it because it had put a tremendous amount of emphasis on participation, and participation that was bold and creative. And it was, you know, if we did nothing else, we would think about how to bring people in to the planning process of our actions and really make space for people's voices and for people's creativity. And I think that that was why there was so much energy and so much heart in that movement. And there was a real sense of trying to be reconstructive and visionary in what we were doing on the streets. So, you know, in the anti-globalization movement, which I'm not going to really sort of talk about the history of it, but I think we were really inspired by the Zapatistas. We were also really inspired by Reclaim the Streets and sort of the idea of celebration in the streets, of really like not just coming out in an angry way, but coming out really showing a liberatory form. The term temporary autonomous zone, which I didn't love back in the day, but that was very much a part of the movement. And having actions where there was actually a sort of democratic process in the streets, where we were just a very vibrant culture around creating direct action. And I think it brought a lot of people in the movement. I think there's some pieces specifically that are a big part of this movement. I think the People's Mic, my first experience of it was back in the anti-globalization movement. We didn't use it to the extent that we do now, but I think it's a really significant piece. I think the most emotional sort of action experience I had back in the anti-globalization movement was outside the jails in Seattle in 1999. We didn't have a microphone, so we used the People's Mic for 4 hours and held a spokes council trying to figure out a contingency plan. And it was incredibly powerful and emotional. I've talked about it a lot of times, but I don't think I realized that it actually should become a central organizing tool. I think that it's an incredible tool that we've used, obviously, really well in this movement in terms of just, and it came out of necessity, but really making people feel like they're being heard. It's one thing giving voice, it's another thing actually making people know that their voice is heard. And I think that contributed in a really significant way to the power of Zuccotti Park. Other things like jail solidarity and snake marches, there's lots of aspects of tactics that really sort of grew up in their own ways in the anti-globalization movement. And the things that I think are messy about what we sort of left this movement when it comes with respect to direct action, one is the sort of ambivalence around centralized actions versus decentralized actions. And the reason I think we got left with a bit of a mess is because in the anti-globalization movement, we spent a lot of time in the early years doing centralized actions. They were decentralized in the planning, but it was all about coming together and shutting something down together. So, you know, in Seattle, we drew a big pie chart. We made 13 slices of the pie, had people break up into affinity clusters, and but it was all about shutting it down together. And and then we tried, and that was obviously really successful, but we tried to keep doing that. And so we continued to do sort of centralized actions, or focused on a centralized spot, but we weren't able to shift our strategies, our tactical strategies, and so we were finding that our strategy was failing. So, as I think is common in most movements, if something doesn't work, you don't just sort of inch along here, you go here. So, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We ended up, everyone was like, oh, the centralized actions, it's, they don't work, and people found the meetings tiresome, so let's do decentralized actions. And that's kind of where we were, when I would say the anti-globalization movement sort of came to an end around the time of 9/11, where everybody was really focused on affinity group actions and sort of snake marches in the streets and just hitting lots of diverse targets, maybe telling people where you were going to be, maybe not, creating zones. And I think that's all, it's fine, but I can't say that just in thinking about it, I can't say that I remember any moments. When you really think about what's had impact on you, the moment of being in the streets with 50,000 people doing something together is really it sticks with you, it builds you. Remembering, the Republican National Convention even, which was really awesome, but I don't remember a lot about it because there weren't moments that felt like, holy shit, we did it. It was diffuse, and it allowed for a lot of different groups to have different pieces of it. But I think that this movement is sort of quite interested. The occupation is what sort of pulls it all together, which I think is actually way more impactful than any of our shut it down street actions, and a lot of it impactful in terms of movement building. The moment of the occupation is way more meaningful, I think, than even shutting down Seattle was, in terms of a feeling of something significant. But I see in where the DA is going now, that we don't have an occupation is quite focused on sort of decentralized actions, and I don't think that's going to create movement building in the way that we want it to. So I kind of wish that we had sort of resolved that a little bit more back in the past, and maybe we wouldn't be in a place where people are sort of really excited about the idea of decentralized actions. The other piece is diversity of tactics, which back in the day, we didn't finish that conversation. Diversity of tactics means everything and nothing. And I think what people meant back in the day without saying it was from sort of very, very safe, peaceful, nonviolent actions to low-scale property destruction. Mostly property destruction that was either that, and also doing active self-defense in the street, really, fighting back. But nobody was talking about taking offensive, violent actions against police. We weren't talking about ambushing the police. We're not talking about firebombing offices. There's a million things that I think clearly was not part of the conversation, and people wouldn't have supported, even if you supported diversity of tactics. I don't think people would support, doing physical violence to people in an offensive way. I still don't think that's the case. But we're stuck with this term diversity of tactics that is wide open, and I feel like it's. I wish we had finished that conversation and really came up with a definition that would be helpful for this movement, because now we're stuck with that. So that's all I wanted to say about the direct action aspect of it. Again, I think the Occupy movement in their boldness, or in our boldness and in our creativity, have surpassed the anti-globalization movement, which is really exciting to me. Last night was really beautiful. There's just so much creativity and so much love and energy, and it's very, in that aspect, I think that's really important. The Occupy movement is, if nothing else, a really, really inspiring resistance movement. I think it wants to be a revolutionary movement as a resistance movement, but with exciting aspects of sort of reconstruction. But I don't think it's a revolutionary movement, and I'm going to talk about that later. So the next piece I want to talk about is the horizontal politics, which is obviously inspired by many things, but the anti-globalization movement being one of them. So in the anti-globalization movement, we used particularly the spokes council model really heavily. We had people who brought the spokes council model to us. Lisa Fithian, who's still really involved here, David Solnit, who's very involved on the other coast, Nadine Block. There are a bunch of people that were very involved in the anti-nuke movement that used the spokes council model and brought it to the anti-globalization movement. And because we were able to build towards the anti-globalization movement with some forethought and some time, and we were there was a lot of self-consciousness around what we were going to bring in Seattle. We were able to do that in a really measured way. And so, we started the spokes council process in the summer before November, and we were clear about what we were doing and the size that we were wanting to go for, whereas the Occupy movement was taken by surprise. The structures in the anti-globalization movement felt really solid to me. Like the processes just worked for the most part. There were problems, but they worked. And there wasn't a lot of drama around them, which is obviously not the case in this movement, unfortunately. And so coming into this movement, when I entered into it, I was a little, I saw the GAs in the beginning, and I thought, oh my God, they were less formed than the spokes council, and obviously that would work for like an action, but it wasn't going to work as a coordinating body. What it did do, together with the People's Mic, is create a really, really powerful emotional space. And I think that cannot be underestimated, because building a movement requires that type of emotional buy-in. And walking into Zuccotti Park, as I think probably many of us experienced, was a very powerful experience because of the General Assembly, amongst other things. The General Assembly was this space for a lot of people, particularly people who had never been in a movement before. There are so many people who are completely new, who I think wouldn't have stuck around if it weren't for the General Assembly and that experience of actually having your voice heard, really seeing all walks of life entering into this space and starting that project together. What the thesis I'm kind of working on in my thinking right now is that because the General Assembly, in the anti-globalization movement, while direct democracy was really central to what we were doing, this is what democracy looks like. It was all about direct democracy against global capitalism. That was central to what we were doing. It was completely central to our vision. It was probably our only vision, but it was acknowledged that centrality was still a means to an ends. And in this movement, I think that it became the ends and the start. That's what I'm kind of working on, and you guys can tell me I'm full of shit, but that's what I've been trying to figure out why direct democracy, which is the core of the Occupy movement, has also not worked particularly well. I mean, the GAs and the spokes councils, not just in New York, are really difficult in lots of parts of the country. And I think it's in part because the General Assembly is not very nuanced, and it's really created for movement building, and people are trying to use it for coordination and decision making in a certain way that it's not built very well for. It's built incredibly well, again, for movement building, for bringing people in. But I think because it became the heart of the Occupy movement so quickly, and because it was the heart of a movement that was bringing so many people in who had no experience with direct democracy and had very little sort of nuanced understanding of the different types of directly democratic structures you could be working with, you ended up with people getting very emotionally attached to this one form and seeing it as their sort of link to their humanity, to their new self, to their new understanding of possibility. And if there's a really interesting book called Freedom is an Endless Movement, and it looks a lot at SNCC and the feminist movement and lots of movements throughout the ages, And I think the underlying thesis of the book is what really is the glue for many of these movements is their destruction. And so I'm kind of wondering whether direct democracy, in some ways, has the potential to be the destruction of the Occupy movement if it's not self-conscious about that potentiality. And I think if the way that the GAs and the spokes councils have gone for the past bunch of months in OWS were to continue, which I don't think it will, I think we're smart and we're going to move out of that, it would be the death of our movement, because there's just no way to get out of it. Luckily, the direct action group is sort of is using their structure towards they're seeing their structure as a means to an end. It's a form with a function, but at the moment, the rest of those structures in OWS are not being seen as a form in aid of a function. They are the function themselves, and they're just wiggling. There's no the GA other than last night where it was a movement building structure is functionless. It's not self-conscious. It shouldn't be a body it's not a useful body for making financial decisions. It's just not, there's better ways to do that. So I think that it's really important for this movement to move to a place where they have a much more nuanced understanding of direct democracy, are really looking at it as central, but as a form that needs to be, that really needs to be responsive to its function. It still needs to have its principles and its vision, but it needs to have its function just determining what form we use, and we need to be flexible to when our strategy changes, to be able to change the structures. And that's been extremely difficult. So I think that we're going to do it, but we need to do a lot. There are conversations about that happening right now. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is, do I still have time?
Yeah, finish up.
Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is strategy, because largely due to the fact that, like the anti-globalization movement, we've got this project of direct democracy and this sort of lofty revolutionary vision that we're very committed to and unwavering in our commitment to these sort of revolutionary values, down with capitalism, direct democracy, horizontal politics. And I think that it's really important that people are really wanting to maintain consistency and are trying to be prefigurative in how we organize now and keep it consistent with our vision. But I think that our vision is not clear, and because our vision, I feel like the vision is a bunch of sort of terms and slogans, but isn't very deeply formulated yet, and it's very difficult, obviously, because it's shifting the entire way that power is held in society. So it's a huge challenge. But if we don't spend the time to really anchor our visions in something that's concrete, it's not a blueprint, but like really understand what we're going for and be able to articulate it, we're not going to be able to build strategy and actually have a firm strategic orientation. And I think we need to do both of those things, but we really need to be able to ground our vision, talk about strategy in a really concrete way. And I think unless we do that, unless we can really talk about our strategic orientation, our principles, our vision in a much more concrete way, the movement ends up being a little bit afraid of everything outside of it. And it's not going to become a revolutionary movement, it's going to stay a resistance movement. Because in order to move to a revolutionary movement, we're not going to have a revolutionary movement that's just a resistance movement. We're going to have to have a much broader strategy. And right now the Occupy movement is, I think, if it can ground itself more deeply in its own identity, and it's fine that the Occupy movement be the resistance side of a revolutionary movement. I don't think the Occupy movement's situated to do all the other pieces necessarily. But until we get really confident and clear in who we are, I think everything else looks too scary to work with. And I think we need to ground ourselves in our own identity so that we can then self-consciously figure out who we want to work in coalition with and how not to be frightened of that process, because I think right now we're in a place where the Occupy movement's afraid of co-option still, afraid of building alliances, because it's fearful that it's going to take our identity away. And I think we have to really ground ourselves in our own identity so we can do that work, or we won't get to that. We won't be able to build towards a revolutionary movement.
Thank you.
So I guess one of the reasons I was asked to be on this panel, as Pam said, is because I'm writing an article for Platypus called "The New Left Zombie is Finally Dead," along with the Occupy movement. And I guess I'll briefly go over some of the ideas within that essay, and I'll try and put it within the topic of this panel, which is 1999, 1968. I should say that in that essay, I don't mention the no WTO anti-globalization movement at all explicitly, mostly because I didn't see it as an important jumping off point for anything. Actually, after hearing some of the things you said, I'm starting to understand Platypus's, what they've been talking about the link between the two. And I think that Platypus has done some good work and has some very astute points about the connection between the two movements. But I think making some kind of direct claim between Occupy and the anti-globalization movement, as if Occupy is the anti-globalization movement allowed to flourish if 9/11 didn't happen, is problematic. You know, I trace the Occupy movement personally from my own experience to different lineages, and I think within a horizontal movement, within a horizontal movement, there will only be any kind of narrative will only be partly true. I think it's just as true that it's hugely influenced by Egypt. It's hugely influenced by the student takeovers in Chile. And I think different people coming to the movement came at it from these different experiences. To me, I saw the cultural anarchism that kind of came back in a big way around 2004 and 2006 between the punk subgenre crust. And I saw that countercultural anarchism, which was kind of the new left's politics being moved into its most extreme inward self, as if it's just, you know, cultural production on a very small scale, like making zines, doing shows, very cut off from the rest of the world. And through the Occupy movement, I actually saw a lot of those same people change focus and link up with a bigger, more populist narrative and start to have an economic focus instead of a countercultural focus. I mean, I think obviously the no WTO movement was there in the mix as one of the many influences, but I think, you know, the nature of any event is you're trying to put some kind of narrative over it. That's what intellectuals and talking heads alike are trying to do about the Occupy movement, and that becomes very difficult in a horizontal movement because there's so many different competing narratives going on at the same time that I don't put I don't think it's accurate to put overwhelmingly a lot more emphasis on one instead of the other, especially since it's still changing what the Occupy movement will become. Hopefully it'll go on and grow in the spring. My other point in my essay is that I think it's a significant break from what the new left was, I guess there's a tendency to try and see new movements and have it be informed by history and be informed by what's happened. But I've actually seen in the Occupy movement people like me who are, you know, left history buff or nerds kind of and I definitely put myself strongly in that category, missing what's actually going on because we're seeing it through an older lens of what's happening. And I think it's worth actually, in some senses, letting go of history to try and actually let yourself see it as a new paradigm and let yourself see it as something genuinely new and genuinely different. Doesn't mean that no kind of historical context is helpful. In certain situations it can be helpful, but I also think it can be equally restrictive. For one, say, just to take an example, the New Left's direct democracy and Occupy's horizontal process. I've seen it written about that Occupy's horizontal process will lead to extremists taking over the Occupy movement. I guess it's kind of a it's a comparative to kind of the 1969 SDS kind of moment when there was this split, and the Weatherman took SDS's name and all of that. And actually, the Occupy's horizontal process works exactly the opposite of this because it empowers a minority to block things. So a lot of narrative is blocked. There was no meta-narrative over the whole movement because of this reason. But when people agree, when something is decided, all people are coming together to make this decision. So it actually is very different than the New Left's method. I've actually I was talking to Todd Gitlin, and he was telling me that in the New Left there's a lot of kind of fist banging and working out and talks all night and arguing back and forth. And the Occupy movement has always been very different than that. I think there's kind of a more agreeable climate around what the Occupy movement is. And I think what's significant about the Occupy movement, there's a tendency to see it as specifically anarchist. And to me, what's significant about it is the coming together of a lot of different beliefs and the kind of dropping of these older ways of seeing things. To me, what was significant about Occupy was not that it was this form of anarchism that was actually very popular before the Occupy movement. It's just being talked about a lot more because through the Occupy movement, it's gotten a lot more notice. But it was very popular before then. These same people who were anarchists before the Occupy movement and are still anarchists now. What's significant to me is that it's a coming together of these kind of people with labor activists, with other kinds of activists, and that they're sharing ideas and they're disagreeing and they're coming to some kind of for lack of a better word, we like to call it a new paradigm, and I think that's a great way to put it. For instance, at May 1st meetings, there's the issue now about whether to call for a general strike, right? And a lot of the people in the Occupy movement who are super, super involved want to call for this general strike, and then the older labor activists will say, no, that's a labor term, that's a bad thing to call for, that's never going to happen. And to me, I sit at these meetings, and to me, the victory is that conversation is happening. It doesn't matter what is decided. What matters is that these two forms of activism that never touched each other, this kind of direct democracy, anarchism, and these labor activists are together at this meeting discussing this. And I think there's another interesting point. Occupy kind of breaks things up in a new way, whereas people who are more radical, or sometimes not people who are more anarchist or more socialist, or are interpreting Marx in the most earth-shattering way, it's people who think there's more of a possibility for what could happen, right? The more radical people in the Occupy movement right now are the people who actually believe a general strike could happen, right?
Is it radical or delusional?
Is it radical or delusional? I think the point is, in August, I was at a lot of the GAs, and I walked out of the first GA because I said, we need to have some kind of purpose about what this is about. And the facilitator, and this was the second GA, August 8th, the facilitator said, do we want to have the much longer conversation about what this is about, or are we going to talk about how to actually take over the park? And I walked out, and I came back to the other GAs, and I remember there was this one, I don't want to say her name, but she was, clad in black. She would smoke cigarettes and just be like, Occupy should be about nothing. She was like this stereotype of an existentialist. And she'd from Greece, and she would smoke, and she'd yell about, no, there must be no nothing should be over at Occupy. We're just going in, we're taking the park. And at the time, I was like, this woman's crazy. This woman's crazy. There's no hope for this lasting outside a day, lasting outside 2 days. Like, how is labor going to, because at the time I was obsessed with getting labor involved in Occupy, which actually happened anyway. And then the Occupy movement actually happened. And this idea that I formerly thought was crazy, not having some kind of demand, not having some kind of narrative over the Occupy movement, I instantly saw allowed for a plurality of space. It allowed for a reconstituting of people's ideas on the left specifically, a reconstituting of what our social movements are themselves. And so I was wrong about that, just because in this one time period, with all of my knowledge of the left, I thought that the Occupy movement would be impossible, being as what it was, and then it became this massive success. And to me, one of the most significant things is how it's not the new left. And even if you don't think it's a new paradigm, I think it's worth pragmatically to think of it as a new paradigm, because perhaps that'll be most helpful in achieving the biggest lasting change. So I actually wanted to end with Ism Christie is one of the people in August who spent literally every day just planning the Occupy movement. And there are a lot of these people, and like the press hasn't talked about them or anything, and some of them are my heroes, because they don't care for the press or anything. They just wanted to put this together. And he, in his article, he has a Nietzsche quote that I wanted to read. Cheerfulness, belief in the future, the joyful deed, all depend on knowing the right time to forget, as well as the right time to remember. Instinctively, see when it is necessary to feel historically and when unhistorically.
Okay, I have some questions for you guys, and then, maybe we can have some responses, and we have enough time, but then we can just open it up to Q&A. But just in response to some of the things that you all were saying, Brooke, you talked about like continuity and discontinuity, and then you sort of articulated as well there are these messes that we've passed on, kind of unresolved problems that then are just sort of passed on to new movements after us. And I guess I had a question about what were the messes that were passed on to you all, like when you all were building a movement, what were the unresolved problems that you felt like you had to deal with? And specifically, because then later you formulated it as if we had one message, it would have been direct democracy against capitalism. And that that already comes with a lot of messes. And so what was, I think, the general conversation during this period about political attempts at transforming and overcoming something like capitalism? How did people make sense of this? I know that you said that there was a lot of inspiration from the kind of Zapatistas movement, and so what were the decisions that were being made about like what would the movement be about? And if I just may, I'm just going to throw this out there, and then you guys can just respond. You talked about how during the anti-globalization movement, direct democracy was a means to an end, and that your concern was that in Occupy was becoming a kind of end in itself from the very beginning. And you then sort of separated these different moments within the alterglobalization movement, the coordination of what could happen, and then the means of drawing people into a movement. So you said that direct democracy and something like GAs were really good at drawing in people into the movement. You said that it created a powerful emotional space where people felt heard, and so it was effective. But that the actual, I guess what I'm wondering, like conversations about coordination and maybe even the meaning of the movement, like when were those happening? Like what was it, what did those look like? So maybe they're related.
Are you talking about now or in the end?
Then, yeah. And okay, and then Dave, so this issue of like history and giving the present a narrative. because we talked about this before. I'm Dave's editor on his article, and I know that you have like a kind of a pragmatic way of thinking about narrative. One like builds a narrative insofar as it helps one sort of create possibilities, or maybe you can articulate it better the way in which you think about it. But and so for you, you talk about history as a restraint, like as a kind of limitation. But isn't it also, like, I guess riffing from the Nietzsche quote, like when is there like a moment in which one needs to give the present a kind of force towards the future, and can making that present intelligible, making it sort of like available for understanding and strategizing and thinking about a transformation, like how can history be useful in this way? What would it mean for, what would that kind of relationship with like a history be about? And you cite off the cuff that now occupies a success, and I just kind of wanted to ask you, like, what is the criteria for success that you have in mind? I know a lot of the ways in which my conversations with people who are in Occupy are about is the feeling of being heard, the feeling of building movement, the feeling of making decisions. But I always raise the question if that's really what's happening here, meaning is it actually increasing agency? Is it opening up emancipatory possibilities, or does it feel like it? And is that different?
I guess for the first question to history, I don't think.
Dave, is it okay if I let Brooke?
her. I'm
No
sorry.
problem. No problem. I know I was looking at you the entire time.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries. Those were really enormous questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I mean, it's interesting because I don't know that I saw the messes coming into the anti-globalization movement. I had been an activist, but I hadn't been, engaged in any kind of big mobilizations. That was sort of where I entered. So I'm sure if you ask somebody who had more of a historical understanding than they would have more of a sense. From what I've read, it's funny because some of the things that we've passed on that are still messy around diversity tactics and things like that were messy in the anti-nuke movement. And if you read, I think it's Winnie Bryan's book, it's either Winnie Bryan's or James Mansbridge, who writes about the clamshell alliance, and you see like the same conversations were happening back then on a slightly different level. Like, should we cut the fence? Is that violent? Just which now would be seen as kind of ridiculous. Of course, you cut a fence around a proposed nuclear site. That would, I don't think anyone would question that in our movement. But it's what's that?
There's an ongoing discussion right at this moment about there's actions happening in Vermont later this week against these discussions are still definitely, there are people who take that position. It's not a dead duck.
Interesting. Okay, well so I think there's some, I would say the biggest mess, which is a mess that's not, a lot of these messes are messes in part because they're complicated. But the question of securing power is something that we didn't come into the anti-globalization movement with an understanding of, we don't have it now. I don't think we've done a tremendous amount of, I don't know that there's been a tremendous amount of clarity on that as anti-authoritarians, how to engage the state. I think that's really complicated. I think that complicated topics are topics that often people avoid rather than actually having conversations. So, avoid elections, just don't vote, but you can't, if we had the conversations, there might be more of a nuanced sense of like, okay, the referendum, how is that different? Is it different local elections versus national elections? Is there some room for voting defensively? Like, we avoid those conversations. So there's no understanding of how to engage the state and securing power generally. Like, okay, so, as we're moving forth as a resistance movement, then or now, how are we going to secure power? This direct democracy that we're talking about, like what we're doing is largely symbolic unless we can actually secure power. For creating, I think the conversations were similar then and now, only now we're actually more localized. The idea of having citizens' assemblies or neighborhood assemblies was not where we got with the anti-globalization movement, even though that was a clear goal back then. If you had asked a lot of us what we wanted, neighborhood assemblies. Even after 9/11, that was something that a lot of us were putting forth. Like, let's get community centers and neighborhood assemblies going as sort of like a response to the 9/11 sort of fervor. But I think that there's no sense of how to actually take these moments of direct democracy and broaden them out to the greatest extent possible, so there's the potential of actually creating a dual power situation, of actually really creating something that is in tension with the state specifically, that is actually gaining real popular legitimacy. And so those strategic discussions, I don't think we really got to back then, and didn't have a lot of guidance as to how to go about that. And I still think we don't have that now. Your other question was on coordination and drawing people in the anti-globalization movement.
Yeah, and you just said, I think that you're kind of talking about that you just said, a lot of it is symbolic insofar as the goal is to actually have a challenge and power. And so those conversations about what power means and these tactics, the larger conversation, I guess, beyond tactics, capitalism, democracy, these discussions, like what are the forms that they took?
Okay. We were looking at global capitalism, and I think we were really clear about that systemic change as being necessary. I felt like we were coming out as anti-capitalist. We felt like that word was like not really welcome until, maybe after Seattle or sort of. So we were very clear about systemic change needing to happen, that we were looking at capitalism and the state colluding to what we were seeing as sort of the pinnacle of the capitalism really disintegrating the state, and that we needed to really build this, directly democratic society. But it was, again, very stuck in like maximum vision, like this is where we want to go, and there's not a sense of the transition, like how do we get from what we want and what we're sort of symbolically, prefiguratively creating to actually, shifting things in a way that actually creates a popular movement that actually has popular legitimacy. And I think it's because it's really difficult. But because it was so difficult, it's way easier to focus on tactics and to get really captivated with tactics and really self-congratulatory about how big your mobilizations are, when really you know that there's an elephant in the room, and that's that you have absolutely no idea how to even start creating the world that you want to create beyond tactics. But you had asked about the coordination, like the GA versus like the. I think the GA brings in people better than any organizing body we had in the anti-globalization movement, because our structures, which were functional, and you could come in and feel like a lot of people walked into the Direct Action Network and just got involved, and I actually think it was accessible, but it wasn't like exciting. It didn't bring in thousands of people. You might say that in some ways that's like a sounder way of doing movement building, to bring people and plug them in a way that's like accessible, and versus a lot of people came into the park, got really, really excited about it, way more people than we ever brought in, but didn't know how to engage, and could, still maybe can't figure out exactly how to engage or where the power lies or how it actually all works. So I don't think we had the movement building structures, anything like the GA back then. We had, huge action spokes councils, thousands of people before Seattle, but you already got your ass out to Seattle. You already knew that, you were already active to a certain extent. It wasn't like we were drawing in people off the street so much. There were some people, yes, that happened, but it was really, we didn't have anything that was that good at drawing people in like in that way.
50 Cent didn't show up at your...
No. So right now, I think that we need to stop thinking about one body. I think we need to build a lot of different bodies. I think we need a clearinghouse structure that's citywide, that isn't focused on decision making, that brings in lots of different movements, that brings in labor and brings in community-based organizations, and allows those conversations to happen in a way that's not surrounding OWS, but is involved, has involvement from. I think we need real political organizations that that are comfortable coming forth with vision and demands in politics that the movement's not afraid of, but that's just one of many tendencies. I think we need to keep doing GAs, but really look at their limitations and know that we're doing them and they're really, really important, but not saddle them with work that's not appropriate for them. So, yeah.
I guess addressing history first, I don't think that history is useless to understanding the present, or history should be, I mean, I majored in history for 5 years. But, you know, yeah. But, I mean, I think it's interesting because when you look at the New Left, which I studied for such a long time, and you look at like the 1968 period when the Maoists came back in, you had progressive labor, and then you had the Weathermen, and like a lot of the narrative is the New Left is making the same mistakes the old left is making. It's bringing back the worst aspects of it, like this burrowing in from the inside. I think that's true, and I think perhaps if there was, you know, some more of understanding of the history at that point, that would be somewhat helpful. But I think what's interesting about the Occupy movement, and what I'm specifically talking about, is people don't tend to see the Occupy movement as something that came out of 30 years that were dominated by the New Left's ghost narrative that was pervasive over culture and politics, right? And I think that the Occupy movement comes directly out of that and is a move this way, right? It's a move away from the kind of politics that began in the 60s and 70s, dominating both our cultural landscape and our political landscape. And I think it's a turn because of its economic focus. And its economic focus, and it's not purely economic, and it keeps some of the best parts of the New Left, you know, and what started in the 60s, which would be, to me, you know, an emphasis on, you know, anti-racism, sexism, cisgender privilege. But it also brings it back to an economic focus. And to me, this economic, this cultural economic focus, right? And so far it's just in culture, is going to have fundamentally different results, and is having fundamentally different results than what we've had in the 30 years since there hasn't been something called a left. So that's why I think that right now it's within the Occupy movement, I've seen people view it through a New Left kind of scope, as seeing it like repeating the same mistakes as the 60s, and like doing similar, you know, direct democracy. It's what happened in the 60s and it led to this and that. And I think my point is that doing that is missing the point of what's actually happening. And that's why I think that this historical view of it in many situations needs to be suspended. And I guess I can give a direct example of that happening so I can clarify what I'm saying. I think there were points where there was actually like, let's see, where for lack of a better example, the demands committee, I guess, saw people seeing things as needing a wide narrative over everything, so that the same mistakes weren't made of lots of splinter cells going off in a lot of different directions, right? But what they didn't understand is it was 30 years of all of these splinter cells actually coming together and re-talking about things in general. It was coming out of all this splintering of the 60s and 70s, right? So if we see it again and try and view it through this narrative of being a repeat of the 60s and 70s, we're missing the point that it's coming out of the fragmentations of that period, going back. What's significant about Occupy is that it's like, was a reconnecting of all these various strains that were all over the place. So I guess that's partly what I mean. I don't mean that the analysis through history is always fruitless. And I guess that's a good question. Why do I consider Occupy a success? I mean, I guess the common one is that it's changed the narrative, right? It's changed the kind of things that we talk about in this country. And I think that's a huge beginning. For me personally, with the group, the working group that I helped form, and most of the things that I'm saying I don't share with my working group. It's not related. Occupy Your Workplace, we're interested in organizing the unorganized. We're interested in encouraging worker takeovers. We're interested in giving some kind of support to unorganized workers outside unions. And for us, the praxis is making that change, right? Because if you can go out and organize workers directly, you're gonna directly build power. So there's no direct action that's opposite to some kind of larger conversation that needs to happen. That the action is already leading to the kind of substantial change that our group at least is looking for.
Okay, questions? I'll just take maybe 3, and if they're too easy, test 1, 2, and then 3.
Thank you guys so much. That's really interesting. I have many questions, and we're trying to just focus on 1 or 2. Experience of being involved, kind of being engaged, making these kind of moments happen, and registering them for what they are in themselves or something. That then leaves open the question of, okay, well, where do they head? Where do they lead? Right? And there's, the 60s, if nothing else, were in a kind of time when people's intentions were kind of, it's like the ruse of history or whatever, the quote, hey, whatever, they meant one thing to happen and then a lot of other things happen that they wouldn't be so happy with. I mean, the kind of example of our moment is well, okay, we have a African American in the presidency, but the kind of transformation of society that was intended by civil rights activists isn't really represented by that, but nevertheless, that's a kind of consequence. Right, and so I'm wondering how you see the relationship between a historical consciousness and a sense of how a trajectory might play out. Obviously not being able to say okay, for certain this is what's going to happen, but how does one grapple with the kind of contingencies of development? And that's one question I have. And then the other question, just kind of briefly, and it's something that was in the description, I helped write the description, that's why I'm going to bring you guys back to it. But I wanted to ask you guys to reflect on the kind of distinction between our moment and the 68-99 moment, which is the two eras of prosperity in which you had kind of large-scale kind of protest movements built, versus today, which you have one of the most severe economic downturns in the past 100 years. We're in the midst of it still. It's kind of ongoing. It's not, they talk about recovery, but that's something spurious. And we have an economic recovery. When I say a job growth recovery, and it's not just the United States. It's larger. It's global. So I'm wondering what your sense is of how that distinguishes our moment, how it kind of defines our moment versus the other moments, kind of Clinton era of bubble 90s, and then the kind of great society of the 60s or something The other thing I wanted to mention is just because you've been bringing up the 60s. No, this isn't a question, but just Bernadine Dorn was going to be on the panel. She was really close to being on the panel, but then realized she was still going to be in Europe at the time. But it's unfortunate.
I'm going to move on now. Very good, Chris.
So I have a question for each of you, mainly clarifying. This is something I actually heard from various people about mouths, how one of the major differences between the 60s and the left and today is that the 60s is more focused on a cultural movement, whereas today it's economic and labor. But I've always threw my hands up with frustration because I found the 60s to be just as serious about economic and labor problems. Not to mention that some of them, the 60s culminated into some of the largest labor strikes in the 70s in history. So, and plus a lot of the rhetoric, C. Wright Mills about the power elite and how the anti-war and how they realized that, a lot of the war issues were bound to economic reasons, the industrial, military complex and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, why would you make that kind of dichotomy? And then how do you envision the labor issues and economic issues different from today versus the 60s? Because it really was a serious matter. And then you said also an interesting point about how Occupy right now is kind of stuck in the realm of a resistance movement, and it's not yet towards a revolutionary movement. I just kind of wanted these clarifying terms, what do you mean by resistant movement, and what would a revolutionary movement be? And then, I have my own understanding of those terms, but I kind of understood the 99 moment predominantly as a resistant movement because they focused on these WTO singular events, and they were just trying to thwart all of these big heads coming and convening. So it seemed, there was larger goals at stake, but tactically and strategically, they were mainly focused on stopping these kind of meetings, these G8 summits and stuff happening. So could you please like kind of define a little more what a resistance in a revolutionary movement is, and then do you agree that 99 was basically a resistance movement, and what would we have to do now to kind of move beyond that kind of that limit?
I'm actually going to let these guys answer, and then we're going to take like another round because it's a lot. So
Yeah.
then
Do you want to start?
I just thought they were.
Okay. In terms of the sort of economic climate right now, obviously it's hugely significant in the United States. I think that the ability, during the anti-globalization movement, I wasn't getting high fives from homeless men on the subway platform. It was just, it's an extraordinary moment of potential solidarity around a shared crisis. I think that comes with a lot of responsibility because I think that we need to figure out how to build a popular movement, which is very different than an activist movement. And in terms of how we bring people into engagement, I don't think that all the people that we have the potential to build with are going to come out and dress up as clowns and run around the 4th Street with us. How do we shift how we're engaging people? I don't know that citizens' assemblies in different neighborhoods is the way that we need to engage. I just think that figuring out how to engage on a popular level is a much different project, certainly than the anti-authoritarian part of the left. I really appreciate what you're bringing in about all these pieces coming together. I think that OWS is probably at its core sort of new kids and probably pulling on the anarchist tradition. And the anarchist tradition is not good at building popular movement. So those other fragments need to feel really, and I feel like a lot of those other fragments are around the outside, being like, a lot of the community-based organizations, they're good at that, or certainly a lot better than we are at bringing in communities. But I think they're still a little hesitant to jump in because they don't want people being afraid of them co-opting or overstepping their bounds. And I think that there's a need. But I did want to say that certainly the anti-globalization movement, like this movement, started outside of the U.S. There was not economic prosperity in any of the countries that were really active in starting the anti-globalization movement. They were dealing with, the beginning of the climate crisis and all sorts of pieces of it. So certainly it was extraordinary that the U.S. was able to galvanize the support that we were, I think, in a moment where, we weren't able to connect people on their experience. We had to teach people about the World Trade Organization, which was a more complicated project to have to be like, okay, there are these institutions, and
Brooke, can I ask you, because you said earlier, just in response to Chris, his question about revolution and resistance.
Yes.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that a movement is revolutionary insofar as it can become a popular.
no, not just that.
Okay.
I think a popular movement, I think obviously that is a component. What I would say is it has to have a strategy. It has to have, for me, a revolutionary movement is one that has a revolutionary vision, and that vision's going to shift, but is at least it's self-conscious about what it's doing. Certainly the anti-globalization movement was not. We were a resistance movement. We were a resistance movement with a vision, but that vision was only connected symbolically to what we were doing. And I think that is also true today. I think we're doing a lot more today, but I think for us to be a revolutionary movement, we actually have to build a strategy and that strategy, again, is going to get blown away by the realities of the world as we take steps towards achieving the goals that we see out in front of us. But I think that the Occupy movement is talking about a lot of things that we're doing in the here and now. It's talking about this vague vision, but it's not self-conscious about it. And I don't think that we need to be I don't think we have to have one voice and one strategy. I think we should have a bajillion strategies, but we're not at a place where we're talking about strategy. because it's really complicated, and some of it will require engaging the state and all these icky things that are still really difficult to try and figure out how to talk about without feeling like someone's gonna, I mean, I've had personally some difficult moments in this movement where I've been, any association with anyone that's reformist or anyone that's, in, the move on world is kind of, even talking about it is a little bit dodgy until we get to a place where we're more comfortable with our politics, where we can actually look at some of these other tendencies, see if there's anything in them that's worth bringing into our movement, or to work in coalition with self-consciously, and being able to have a nuanced strategy that's picking the best from different traditions and seeing if we can make a coherent strategy. But until we're able to have those conversations, we're just focusing on tactics, prefigurative politics, and here and now reconstructive projects.
Well, there's like multiple questions. I don't know which one to address first. I guess I can address the 70s and 40s labor uprisings, because in the late 40s, right after World War II, there were major labor uprisings that were crushed by Taft-Hartley Act, and in the 70s. And I think that's a good point. There was an economic strand within the 60s, and it was, for a lot of people who consider themselves left, pretty central to them. I guess there's a difference between people who are making movements and the dominant narrative that becomes about the movement and what it becomes to represent, right? And the results of the 60s are mostly massive cultural changes. Cultural changes that I think are very good. And I'm sure most people in this room think as well, and I'm sure many, possibly not. And it's also, and also I'm sure a lot of us think that a lot of the economic changes were a lot harsher, and this version of capitalism is a lot crazier. But I think it's the dominant, like where the period is at, right? And our period is within a recession, and that's what is matching the economic language. And the left populist language, which is linked up with anarchism, and it's made this nice partnership between this small-scale direct democracy and this larger-scale left populist labor language. I think that's what's significant about Occupy. Not that, I do think anarchism, I definitely agree that the anarchist tradition has a hard time reaching outside of its, the small society they're creating within itself, right? The ideal politics within your group. But I think what's significant about Occupy is it's that kind of politics linked up with a larger left populist tradition. And I guess there's no real answer for why the 60s is not seen as, there's a great book called The New Left in Labor, which talks about that. But I guess it's just the zeitgeist of however people are interpreting the time and what the
historical imagination of it.
What the result is historical. Okay, that's a good way to put it. I think there does need to be a space to talk about what's going on in a movement and to talk about strategies and a multiplicity of strategies instead of maybe one narrative, one strategy. I definitely agree with that. I think some of the best things written about the movement, not from within the movement, are definitely in Platypus. A lot of them are really interesting. But even with the anti-reformist argument, I do think there's a kind of craziness within the Occupy movement against move on, against getting co-opted by the Democrats. But I saw while the park was happening, maybe not right now, but I saw this kind of balance between this very pure politics that was saying, everyone in the Occupy movement who was very involved was saying, don't co-opt us, don't co-opt us, no Democrats, don't co-opt us, no Move On, no Working Families Party, no, no, no. And it was keeping, what the result was, it was keeping Move On and the Working Family Party from saying they spoke for Occupy. It was keeping it, but Move On and Working Families kept using the language, kept saying 99%, kept building on all the energy, but they didn't in any way try and call themselves part of the movement, and it made this nice balance. And that's kind of what I keep seeing within Occupied, is these balances that are created unintentionally between these different ideas coming together. I don't know if I hope I answered every question.
I think Ben's is one of the questions there in the air, but maybe we can come back to it.
Yeah, I wanted to give, I mean, first of all, I have to admit to certain prejudice, which is when people on the left talk about anti-authoritarianism, my immediate reaction is this is coming from like a crypto-authoritarian.
Could you
culture.
speak a little louder?
So I have to admit, first of all, to certain prejudice, but I want to go back to this question of success in the language about reformism, because I think it's such a key. So, in the classic left of like 100 years ago, so the dispute would be between reform and revolution. So you speak about a revolutionary movement. Now, if you look at the left from the standpoint of the revolutionary goal of abolishing capitalism, obviously all revolutionary politics has failed. I mean, the anti-globalization movement was a failure. So the movements of the left that succeeded in terms of the goals they stated were reformist goals. You could say the civil rights movement succeeded. It abolished, legalized racial discrimination. It didn't lead to racial equality. But a certain goal that was like obviously achievable within a certain framework was accomplished. I think that what's striking to me about the Occupy movement is that it's actually quite popular. Large numbers of very ordinary people like the movement. And they don't know much about it, they don't actually participate, but they like something about it. And so I would talk to a lot of people who just run-of-the-mill liberal Democrats, and they'd be sympathetic to Occupy. And they'd say, but like, I want them to have some kind of demand, right? And what that means is very clear. It means like Paul Krugman. It means like put out of politics. No, but in a lot of ways, that's a very sober, sane politics. It's the reference politics, put out of politics, that the left wing of the Democratic Party can adopt. And that's what labor-type politics, like what you talk about as the purism, or seems to me actually an anxiety about a rational reformism. I heard Michael Moore talk on television. He was saying, someone asked, do you want to abolish capitalism or reform it? He said, I want to abolish it. But then when you heard what he was saying, he meant reform it. So I think that there's been a kind of degradation of words, so that like people talk about a revolutionary politics, when really like what they actually aspire to, and again, like to be honest, there's a long tradition of people claiming a revolutionary agenda, whose practice, whether Marxist or anarchist, is some kind of like, ultimately some kind of reformist program. There are any number of supposedly revolutionary Marxist sects who carried out like a basically reformist program. The anti-war movement, the biggest anti-war movement coalitions in the 60s were led by the supposedly Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party that carried out a program that was very much acceptable to the left of the Democratic Party, because it was a single issue just focused on ending the war. So I guess my feeling is like I don't know what your sense of success is. If a success means, well, you have a big movement, you have lots of people out on the streets, then that's a success. But if a success means like transforming the actual social world we live in, then I don't see how any of this can be remotely called a success or even the beginning of a success. And I don't, and like on the 60s when I was shaking my head, I mean, it's not because, like to me, like one of the things that's striking in retrospective of the 60s, it's actually a turning point, fundamentally, I think, in many ways for the right. And I think that there are many aspects of, quote, the cultural changes. I'm not talking in favor of, racism or homophobic. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that there are actual cultural changes from the 60s that had a right-wing potential. And a lot of people drew analogies, for example, between Occupy and the Tea Party. The Tea Party is also, in a weird way, a legacy of 60s protest movements. And people should recognize them. Okay, that's my rant.
Okay.
Very interesting food for thought, thanks. I go back to the 60s, and I'm also a professional historian and teach a class in the 60s from time to time. And 1968 was definitely the seminal event, or the Badooian event for me. And so naturally I think about this quite a bit, and I've been involved in movements all the way up to Occupy. And think about the the parallels, the lineages, and so forth. And last night, for what it's worth, when I was down in Zuccotti Park, Michael Moore was down there, but also I don't know if people know him, but the founder of SDS was down there, Al Haber, from Ann Arbor. And I chatted up with him a little bit, and naturally I had to ask him what he thought if there was this was the New Left reborn, and he said yes. He was wearing his old SDS buttons. Of course, in terms of lineages, nobody's mentioned the new SDS, which some of these old guys have helped to mentor in the last few years on college campuses and among youth. So that's an interesting connection to explore. But I hesitated on that, but both of us did agree that what's different, and much positively so, at least to the eye, not up in Vermont, quite a state of the union, but down here it's so multicultural and multinational. SDS had no black members, and SNCC had a few white members in the early days, but when separatism arose, they were asked to leave. So, but it's so different, at least to the eye, the glance here, people of all colors, and also on what used to be dismissively referred to as the women question. Yes, I know I hear from different sources there are still issues around sexism, racism, etc., maybe ageism, but I see it looks a lot different to me when I'm down here. And also in Vermont, we have the early both SNCC and SDS were heavily male dominant, as you know, and women were relegated to roles of making coffee, basically. And the new second wave of feminism had to arise in reaction to that by people who were involved in SDS, women and some men. So I wonder what you think about that in terms of your history, study of history, and thinking about this. Are we making some progress in this respect in terms of our, the role of multiculturalism? Part of this has to do, I think, with hip-hop, bringing the last couple of decades, maybe this is one thesis I'm exploring, bringing kids together of crossing color boundaries and stuff. And then the women, hopefully, I don't know, maybe you have a different perception from being more inside the movement here, but do you think we've made some advances in that regard in this movement?
Okay, so I think that if we can sum it up, question about like reform, revolutionary movements, definition of a politics that occupy this kind of problem, and then the question about whether or not there's been progress vis-a-vis issues on women and race in the present.
And the whole question of reform versus revolution, I've been talking a lot about that being a misnomer, and that part of it, again, goes back to what I said earlier about being self-conscious about your own politics, your own understanding of power and the strategy. And if you actually have a very firm grasp on what your analysis of power is and what you're trying to create and what this movement is, the strategy around it, it's not black and white. And I feel like I totally agree with you. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say that we made any kind of revolutionary gains except for sort of shift in culture around the we were able to obstruct things, but that's very different than creating a revolutionary movement. I do think that there's aspects of reform that are completely necessary within a revolutionary movement if we're starting from today. One example I give is there's a lot of reforms that if we don't support them, we will not be able to support the development of a lot of marginalized communities in the leadership of our revolutionary movement. If we're not supporting, if we're not supporting reforms around immigration, if we're not getting people out of jail, if we're not, and I think I don't think there's a right or wrong answer necessarily, but if you're looking at how you make sure that as you're building a revolutionary movement, that people have access to it, that people aren't, that there are communities that aren't completely stuck focusing on challenging, environmental health concerns in their neighborhood, but actually, no, we're going to help support them in dealing with their immediate concerns, which may involve reforms, so that they can actually be freed up to join us in fighting for more positive change in terms of like the things that we want, not just the things that we don't want. So I think we have to be really self-conscious about that and not create those hard lines. And if we don't develop our politics in a really strong way and be able to analyze power and analyze power both within the movement and outside of the movement, we're not going to be able to distinguish those two. So I don't think it's a hard and fast rule on reform versus revolution. In terms of doing the revolutionary building, you know, I mentioned a little bit the idea of dual power, the idea of actually making sure that the institutions that we're building, whether they're workers' co-ops, are actually engaged in a dynamic way with the resistance work that we're doing so that we're moving forward together. We're not just creating a smattering of, you know, a smattering resistance here and a smattering of reconstruction here, but that they're actually integrated in a way that's interesting, that's moving us forward. That would be my answer. I don't remember, what was
The second one's about progress,
Oh.
vis-a-vis gender and race.
I'm quite sure that there's progress, but it's a far cry from where we need to be, not just around gender, certainly around race and definitely around class. I think class has been a very definitive challenge in this movement. In particular, I mean, with our occupation, with the form of the occupation, there was much larger class disparity than we had, that was present in the anti-globalization movement in the U.S. And that has continued to be a huge struggle for the Occupy movement to deal with. And it's been extremely frustrating and also has created a lot of incredible conversations and a lot of growth. But I think around gender, race, and class, there's a lot of room to sort of move forward in that and really understand. And I think that the Occupy movement around class in particular, it's been struggling to find sort of a centered accountability. Has been, I would say, we went into the movement with a lot of under accountability, a lot of people really not very conscious of race, class, and gender, and a lot of people from the left sort of coming in, particularly from community-based organizations, being kind of horrified in the beginning, and needing to recognize that this was not the left that had the last 10 years to learn some lessons, but actually a whole new group of people that needed some mentorship, and that were also really open to mentorship. And the amount of growth that I've seen in the last 5-6 months has been really, really tremendous. I think a lot of people who, you know, were sticking their foot in their mouth every 2 seconds now have really done the work to really get some education on that front. So that's been amazing. I think we went through a period of overcorrection where anything that seemed classist or racist or sexist in the spokes council would just kind of halt us in our steps. And, you know, everything would just kind of shut down and people would just kind of freeze up and completely give the floor to whatever came up. And I feel like we're trying to find the middle ground of a sort of a center place around that.
May I ask a clarifying question? You said classist and racist isn't like for an organization based on like basically class distinctions of 99%. Doesn't class play a different role in your analysis from race and gender? Or, like it would in a traditional Marxist politics. I mean, that's to me like what I find like striking. To me, the biggest shift over the last 50 years is the growing irrelevance of Marxism in terms of politics.
Mark's the way to put that.
I mean,
Let's let them finish and then we can.
I certainly think people are not operating from a traditional sort of orthodox Marxist sense of class trumping everything. I think people are very conscious of race and gender and heteronormativity. And I think that...
But the organizing principle of Occupy is presumably class, isn't it? Vaguely expressed.
But race has everything to do with class in our society. Gender has everything to do with class. So people are looking at it more holistically. I don't think, I mean, a class, a movement that's, you know, if we had a movement that was led by poor white men, wouldn't be particularly...
Maybe the clarification that I think this is what we're just trying to get to. Class is a kind of identity as opposed to a kind of big problem that is grounded in something structural. I know that in Occupy, some of the things that you were saying earlier, that overcompensation, was that someone would come into the meetings and they would go like, look, I'm working class and I get something to say and you guys are privileged, and so like I'm gonna talk now. And then people would be like, I guess that's right, if we stick to our, like, yeah, sure, okay. And then this person would just go, you know, for like a rant for like 45 minutes, accuse people of all sorts of shit. Sometimes they were drunk. Like, it was just, come on. Like, yeah, and so, and I think that, so, but that problem was because I think those individuals in that room were like, well, you know, we want this person to be heard, to have like a voice, and if this movement is about empowering people from these different, like in these different identities, then it's our job to hear them. But is class that kind of problem? Is it like an identity that needs to be heard, or is it something else? I think that's what
Yeah,
you're
that's
getting
exactly
to.
what I was trying to say.
I think that he was asking though about internal dynamics. That's what I was
Yes.
responding to.
Yes.
Certainly, and that's what I'm talking about. And I think that if you look internally in the movement and people's sort of personhood, that's different than looking at the structural shift that we're trying to create in the left. But I would also put that in that we're a movement of the 99% looking at capitalism and how it plays out on class, looking at how capitalism disproportionately affects women and people of color. Is if class is the first sentence, those two are the second and third in terms of what we're organizing for. And that's, I mean, I think that's very much bottom line for the Occupy movement, that you're not going to talk about class without talking about race and gender.
So I definitely think that's true, that there is a tradition of people setting out for revolution and achieving reformist goals. You know, the Communist Party in the 1930s with Yul Brynner, you had them actually doing what Occupy is doing now and going in and, you know, taking homes back. And actually they'd re-plug in the heat and turn on the electricity. And actually I was at a Tea Party rally. I had a sign that said Tom Paine was a leftist. The speaker said, you know, I come out of the anti-war movement in the 60s, the guy who was speaking in the Tea Party. So yeah, there's definitely that connection. I mean, with my own group, the reason I think following the strategy I'm following is informed by history, even though I definitely think there's a time to drop it. And you know, our group, Occupy Your Workplace, we're trying to organize workers, and the reason we're trying to do that is we're trying to build power, right? We're trying to build power outside corporations. And hopefully, you know, I mean, I think the hope in the Occupy movement is that it'll lead to a, you know, an era that's not corporate, you know. That's one of the overwhelming narratives in it. As far as multiculturalism goes, I think there was a New York Times article that said it was more effortless for people within the Occupy movement, and I definitely agree that there's still much further and pushing that needs to go, and that there's, you know, not some kind of drop where we shouldn't be talking about things like sexism and racism.
What's more effortless?
It's more effortless for people now within the Occupy movement to you know, talk about things like cisgender privilege and be aware of it, or ableism or something like that, right? It's like very within the culture of Occupy. And I think the reason for that is because it comes out of the 30-year vacuum that the New Left created when it ended, right? And it comes out of all of that new culture that the 60s created. And I guess that's my dominant point about Occupy. It's the one that I keep coming back to. Just seeing it as another 60s is problematic because it's coming out of that, right? It's coming out of the 30 years after that. And I remember the new SDS coming back in activist circles and being kind of like, well, you know, we have nothing else to cling on to, you know, it's the left is so disparate right now, we might as well follow SDS again, but it would be so much better if we could be talking about something new and using new terms. And now that
new Black Panthers as well.
there was but now that the Occupy movement is here, now we have these new terms, and we have these new language, and we have a language that's specifically populist, and this populism is significantly different from the 60s, which is what Richard Rorty would call creating a more a less socially sadistic society with the class analysis drained out of that, right? And I think the Occupy movement has brought back in that class analysis. And I think that, you know, from the start, I can say there's this thing on the left with socialists and Marxists to see Occupy as anarchist. And I can say from the start there were Marxists, socialists, anarchists. They do use a horizontal process, which, you know, I'm very much behind. But David Harvey, if you mention David Harvey within the Occupy movement, people will you know, be very excited. You know, a lot of people very much like David Harvey, or Lefebvre's ideas about space were very influential. David Harvey's kind of taking Marx, because Marx talks a lot about time, right? The capitalist and the pinching and peaching of meal times or whatever, which is in Capital. And David Harvey kind of takes this to talk about capitalist space, right? Instead of just capitalist time. And I think that was influential on a lot of people who were involved in it.
Arnie Negri as well.
Two points of the question. My first point is that I ended up spending 6 weeks in South Carolina after Walt's Occupy, leading up to the South Carolina primary. And I don't know how much you all paid attention to that, but Gingrich ended up winning. I mean, he's from Georgia nearby, but it was the last 2 weeks of the primary where he totally shifted to using Occupy language. All of the signs, all of the street, the bumper stickers and the lawn signs and everything on the television set was very much Occupy language. And it was against the banks and empowering ourselves and providing dignity to ourselves and against the big corporations. That was when he got taken to task by Wall Street for making it sound like this was a class war. And he won overwhelmingly. And he wasn't going into it even though it was his neighboring state. And it was very interesting how popular that language was in South Carolina. I don't think that the people were that excited about it, even though the Tea Party is very well organized in South Carolina. I went to several meetings of Tea Party, and I was really intrigued by the fact that the language of empowerment, the participation. They too have meetings that they don't use human mics, I mean people's mic, but they do have a place where people can be heard. And you can feel people feeling sort of dignified by being, they feel some dignity in being involved in this process. And they are so feeling disempowered by this economy and this polity that they, I was really struck. That's my first comment. And I kept thinking, well, what would be different? And I'm on the worker co-op working group, and we've been, and that's because I think that creating new worker co-ops that are focused on not just OccuCopy, which is one which is feeding the movement copies, but things like healthcare, food, shelter, things that we really absolutely need to survive would be a very good way to start prefiguring what we want. But to actually create it rather than just give it away for free. So I kept thinking, well, can I talk to the people down here in South Carolina? Because I told them, I'm from Brooklyn, and I've been involved with Occupy. And they, oh, really? And so what do you guys do? I mean, they didn't expect somebody who looks like me, because of the vision that you get on television is still that you're a bunch of crazy radicals. And so they were very curious, and I told them about this, and people's reaction was not like, oh my God, that's disgusting. It was really. And so I just, which leads to my question. Brooke, when you say, we need to anchor our vision in something concrete without which there can be no strategic orientation, I think that one of the reasons, I agree with that on one hand, but all of the people's remarkable, to me, ability to grow and change over these 6 months. I just kept watching it over and over again. I was like so shocked. People were so non-self-defensive. They were so open and so willing to admit mistakes and to grow. And I'm thinking, well, this is partly because of this culture, technological culture, and the pace of change that we're living in now. It's so different from when I was growing up. It is much faster. The pace of change is faster, the technology people use to communicate and grow and learn is different. So people don't have, it seems, they don't dig in their heels, so they don't have a chance to dig in their heels. And they're quite willing to grow and change, which I found amazingly refreshing and wonderful. Is there a tension for that generation? I think there might be for my generation. But for that younger generation, is it possible there's no serious tension between creating these bodies you're talking about, like not only the General Assembly for its movement building and the Spokes Council for its coordinating and another body for something else, but articulating a vision anchored in something concrete, as you say, which strikes me as sort of talking not just of something remote and utopian, which has its dangers, but something that to which demands could be linked. Is there a tension between that and people no longer being open? I mean, I think one of the reasons people were open was because the whole thing was open.
Yeah,
But
I have to actually run, unfortunately.
Yeah, so I was concerned that.
I
that we were
have to
going-
run because I have to moderate the next panel.
Okay.
I totally think you're right. I'm not talking about one vision. I'm not talking about Wall Street putting out a list of demands and like, this is what we're going for. I'm talking about challenging people in Occupy Wall Street to develop their own visions so that they can, like, we don't debate, like, I don't think our generation, and maybe Platypus does, but debates aren't seen as like unfriendly. But like, get everybody to write out their visions, and somebody's talking about radical love and another person, and fucking debate. Like, talk about your ideas and let's push ourselves further. And it doesn't, and I do think, like, we don't want to squeeze everybody's ideas into one, because I do think we want to make space for all these fragments to come together, but they need to be not afraid of talking. Like, I don't feel like we don't even, the reason that it's so easy to come together in some respects is because they're not talking about their differences,
Yeah.
which is great. That has a place. Like, we need to be able to have space that can hold us all with our differences. But if we don't talk about our differences, the moving forward isn't going to happen. Like, I want to hear, very orthodox Marxists arguing with anarchists about our vision, so that we can start learning from each other and not be. Like, it's really easy for us to engage in tactics and resistance together. It's going to be more difficult to do the other part, but we're not going to get anywhere unless we start talking and moving towards the other part. We're going to stay doing resistance work. I have to run, but I want to thank you.
Thank you. I'll let Dave close up his comment, so wait.
I learned a lot from you. That was really.
Oh, I learned a lot
interesting
from you too. I didn't know anything about yeah, I mean, this is definitely true. I mean, when I sat down with Todd Ketlin, I was really excited because I've read his book twice, and if you're interested in New Left history, all of the New Left history books are based on his New Left history book. A lot of people don't like it.
I don't like it.
Yeah, but it was still interesting talking to him.
I'm sure.
And that's exactly the point. He just made the point that she made, that, the horizontal process, it doesn't leave room for the debate. And Pam has actually brought this to my attention. And I was like, well, that's why we have Platypus, That was kind of my answer to that, is there's spaces for that outside the Occupy movement. And maybe, perhaps, I could pose as a possibility that the fact that Occupy doesn't have that will allow that to happen in this larger way, right? Everywhere, reconstituting the vision of what Occupy can be, or perhaps it couldn't. But
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.